The purpose of today's video is to examine the macroeconomic toolbox that's open to policymakers, but through the lens of the US government's response to the COVID pandemic between 2020 and 2022. As the pandemic took hold in March of 2020, the first tool that the US government, and specifically the US Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, used was monetary policy. As it became clear that lockdowns were going to go across the globe, financial panic set in. Businesses were rushing to take out loans so that they would be able to pay upcoming expenses without having the revenue to come in. And this sort of contagion spread across markets across the world. Now, at any given time, the primary storer of wealth in the world is US government debt. This is the largest market in the world. We call these treasuries or US government bonds. And what's so useful about these is the market is so big. At any given time, depending on how you measure it, today, just US government bonds is probably worth about $13 trillion, which means that you can buy and sell really however many of those bonds you want, and you won't affect the price of it. This is very important to have a store of wealth where selling it won't affect necessarily the value of that asset, which you can think if you owned a bunch of houses in a neighborhood, for example, and that was your store of wealth. When you sell one house, you increase the supply. The increase in the supply of that house is going to be, maybe enough to drive down home prices a little bit in the neighborhood. Then if you sell two, if you sell three, then you're really going to be affecting the value of your wealth. But the market for US treasuries is so large that that usually isn't the case. Monetary policy was very attractive to policymakers in March of 2020 because it doesn't require political consensus and it doesn't suffer from time lags. Over the course from right around the second week of March through to the third week of March, the US Federal Reserve engages in unprecedented monetary policy. Not only is the interest rate cut down to its lowest level since the 2008 financial crisis on March 15th, but the US Central Bank also engages in quantitative easing, buying billions and billions of dollars in US Treasury bonds, and in some bonds that aren't actually US government debt, but are debt that are backed by mortgages, which makes this policy also qualify as quantitative easing. So in addition to lowering its own lending rate, the Fed is now engaged in open market operations and engaged in quantitative easing. This was necessary because the desire to have cash was even greater than the desire to have treasuries. And so the Federal Reserve, by offering to buy all of these treasuries and give out US dollars for it, was providing liquidity, we say, to the market. And again, you can think of the circular flow model of the economy, and you can think of water or liquid flowing through. This was completely clogged up by the panic of the upcoming shutdown and the impending economic catastrophe that this would cause. The Federal Reserve comes in and just starts pumping extra liquid into the system, and really it creates a situation where it seems to be willing to buy as many treasuries as exist. And one of the wonderful things about this sort of a backstop, which we would say it's going to stop the slide of this asset, is that once you know the Federal Reserve will provide liquidity, you don't need to sell your bonds anymore because they themselves become tradable. So long as you know that someone is going to buy your asset, you don't need to sell your asset anymore. That being said, the US Federal Reserve still ends up buying about $500 billion worth of treasuries by the end of March, unprecedented in US history and in global history. But this provides enough liquidity to the market that the entire global system doesn't completely seize up. But This isn't enough to fully restore confidence in the market. Monetary policy doesn't necessarily give long-term confidence. Just as an example, just because interest rates are zero doesn't mean you want to borrow money if there's nothing particular for you to spend it on, because you will have to pay that back at some point in the future. So at the end of March, the United States Congress passes a $2 trillion stimulus package. It's called the CARES Act. This is the largest fiscal stimulus package in human history. It involves increased support for the Federal Reserve to lend money and to backstop some of the actions it's done. But perhaps some of its most important aspects are direct transfer payments to nearly every US citizen. There's a cutoff of above a level of income that you wouldn't receive a check. But by and large, the US CARES Act, its most dramatic feeling for consumers and for households is that every adult in the United States is going to receive $1,200 and another $500 for every child. This is just a direct transfer payment to increase consumer confidence, to increase business confidence that there'll be somebody out there who's willing to buy their goods and services. And there's also protections for small businesses under 500 employees, where they'll be able to lend money so that they can keep paying their employees. Again, a lot of this is about projecting confidence so other people can be confident for you. It's not obvious that when we look at the total jobs saved, it's not obvious that it was worth the amount of money that was spent on it, but we might need to think of the jobs that were saved because the jobs were saved because the jobs were saved. So if we think of the knock-on effects, that can be really helpful in thinking about this expansionary fiscal policy. One sort of unique thing about this is expansionary fiscal policy often suffers from time lags. It's hard to get political parties to agree about all sorts of things, and it can take time for the government spending to kick in. This package suffers from neither one of those things. And so I won't say it's unique, but it's definitely exceptional to the rule. It's really very fast. It happens within just weeks of the beginning of the crisis. And the pure injection of money into households is an incredibly fast way for the government to shift out aggregate demand. As the pandemic continues and the lockdown continues, these huge packages become less necessary. And as the Federal Reserve continues to stimulate the economy through its monetary policy, we can see some signs of a recovery even by the second quarter of 2020. If you think about the unemployment rate in the United States, it peaks at about 14.8% in April of 2020. It'll be just about half that by the end of the year. So this is a very, very fast reaction. With so much money having been pumped into the economy, and with so much money having been distributed to households, and yet the government actually having taken very few steps towards long-term development, it would make sense that in the second half of 2021, the US Congress finally passes what's called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. And this is a great example of an interventionist supply side policy. It might be worth investigating if you want to really dig into it to see what the original proposal was and then what the smaller actually finally passed proposal is. The final thing that passes is about a quarter of the size of the original proposal, and it takes months of negotiation. So in contrast to the CARES Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill gives it's really clear that it suffers from time lags, it suffers from political pressures, and it is going to be less dramatic because of these things. But one really nice thing that it does is with all of this money in the economy, it would be possible to think ahead and to imagine that inflation could become an issue in the US economy. There's never been such a large stimulus package, and there's never been such aggressive monetary policy. So there are all sorts of reasons to think that, in fact, this could have enough money in the circular flow system that it could start to overwhelm the ability to invest properly. So by investing in infrastructure, we have the government investing in one of our 3 silver bullets, and probably the silver bullet that's fastest to shift out aggregate supply. If you invest in education, it can take a generation to really see more efficient, healthier workers. But if you engage in infrastructure, that can take you as long as the project is going to take. That being said, the bipartisan infrastructure bill intentionally puts its building out over several years. We don't need by November of 2021, to inject the full power of US government spending back into the economy. There's not a feeling that we're in a very large recessionary gap necessarily. By November, when the bill is passed, unemployment has dropped down below to the low 4%, which is really very close to where it was right before the pandemic. In January of 2020, unemployment is 3.6%. And by November of 2021, when the bipartisan infrastructure bill is passed, it's back down to 4.1%. This is more about, if it's justifiable, about shifting out aggregate supply in the long term, rather than using one of the silver bullets to plan for fiscal stimulus. In fact, then, within the next 6 months, the United States is going to start suffering from inflation. Different countries have different levels of inflation with which they are comfortable. And the United States and the European Union tend to be 2 countries that are very inflation averse. And so because of this, even inflation levels that might be acceptable or normal in other countries feel incredibly high in the United States. And this is in fact the case which happens over the summer of 2022. It's interesting to think about whether this inflation is the result of demand pull inflation because of this monetary policy and this fiscal stimulus, or whether it's an example of cost push inflation because the full global supply chain hasn't fully shifted back out and restarted. One of the major drivers of inflation in the United States, for example, are car prices. And this is definitely a supply side problem where the manufacturer of cars stopped, and then also specifically a component of most modern cars, the computer chip, has become in much more demand, and therefore there's been a great shortage of these chips. So there can be 2 different reasons why the inflation happened, and it's totally possible that both those things are happening at the same time. Aggregate demand is shifting out faster, and aggregate supply is been shifted back. We've had something that might be a mini quarter of stagflation, and now it's just restoring slower than was thought. As the interest rates start to be increased over the course of the summer and fall in North America, so that by November 2022, they've gone from near 0.25% all the way up to 3.5%. This is a very rapid increase of interest rates and a constriction of the money supply. And the bank can do this through its overnight lending rate, but also through its open market operations. It can start to sell those treasuries back into the market and suck that cash out of the market that it injected before. One of the most important things for markets, though, is that they are predictable. And one of the major facilitators of our modern financial system are large banks. Well, large banks count on making investments and making loans at interest rates which are then going to return them more than they need to pay out in interest rates. And a really rapid rise in the federal interest rate or in the national interest rate can sometimes catch lenders unaware. And so one of the dangers of these rapid increases in interest rates is ultimately, we know that by increasing interest rates, we're going to decrease aggregate demand. How exactly do you decrease aggregate demand by the right amount without hurting business confidence? Because you just made it more expensive for somebody to open a new restaurant. You just made it more expensive for a business to expand. You made it more expensive for consumers to buy new houses. And if you do this too quickly, it's very easy to come back into a recession. And in fact, this is often the case. This is probably the most historically likely case, which is that when you have high levels of inflation, you have to be ready to get into a recession to shrink down GDP in order to stop that inflation. And inflation can be so detrimental, it's essentially a tax on everybody in your country, that people can be incentivized to accept some unemployment in order to put the brakes on it. But there is also the possibility of what we call a soft landing. If you really manage your monetary policy carefully, you could return aggregate demand to that level of full employment, and you could do it without going too far to cause unemployment. In theory, monetary policy should be excellent at this because you can just do a little bit at a time. In practice, monetary policy is so tied up with business confidence and consumer confidence that it's much more difficult to gauge how your actions will be perceived by the market, not just in the moment, but over how people will act in the coming months. So it's a very inexact science that, of course, thousands of people dedicate their entire life to. Speaking to you now in 2024, it really does appear that a combination of perhaps some interventionist supply side policies, shifting out aggregate supply, and this contractionary monetary policy is going to lead to what economists call a soft landing. It seems as though the US economy is going to return to a level of pretty full employment, seems to be there now, without going into a recession. So it seems as though the US central bank, the Fed, has been able to really pretty perfectly manage demand, and the Congress and the president able to manage aggregate supply, so that in response to this really, really unique crisis, it appears as though the United States is going to have this soft landing, this return. That doesn't mean that the US government did things the best way that they could. It's very easy to criticize some of these responses, especially the CARES Act, as mostly benefiting the wealthiest Americans. And certainly when we look at wealth creation in the United States since 2020, this has been some of the most uneven wealth creation, which is to say that more of the wealth has gone to the already wealthiest people than almost any other time in American history. So that's a really easy way to criticize some of this recovery. At the same time, an important thing to keep in mind is that high levels of unemployment, economic recession, these tend to hurt the poorest Americans the most. So we kind of have to balance out, I would say, in our evaluation. It's not the perfect recovery. It's not the perfect situation, but it's so much better than the worst case scenario. And so in that sense, it's not quite an opportunity cost, but the opportunity cost of doing nothing would have been so high that doing something pretty well can feel really, really, really successful. And I think that ultimately, it seems like here in April of 2024, that that's probably the best description of US government intervention in the economy between 2020 and 2022. It's an unprecedented level of involvement. And so it's a great place to draw real world examples from for expansionary monetary policy, expansionary fiscal policy, interventionist supply side policy, and contractionary monetary policy. Oh, how are you?